I want to welcome everybody today and thank you for attending this joint webinar hosted by the Niskanen Center and the Clean Air Task Force. Today, we're going to talk about the challenge of building all that clean energy infrastructure. Back in August, Niskanen and Clean Air Task Force produced a joint report on this topic, particularly considering private approaches, public initiative, and hybrid models for approaching the challenge of electricity transmission. So I'm going to kick us off with a brief overview of that report, then turn it over to the discussion with Chairman Glick that will be moderated by my colleague at Clean Air Task Force, Lindsey Griffith. My name is Liza Reed. I'm the research manager for low carbon technology policy at the Niskanen Center with a particular specialty in electricity transmission. So this gets right to the heart of all the things I love. So let's kick it off by talking about why transmission. Transmission is the enabling infrastructure for electricity and economy-wide, quite frankly, decarbonization. This image is taken from the Net Zero America report released out of Princeton in December 2020. And you see all those thick purple and magenta lines are new transmission capacity that we will need to meet our decarbonization goals. And those numbers are multiples of the existing transmission capacity we have that has been built over many decades that we now need to build over just a short number of decades. So there's quite a bit of infrastructure capacity that we need to add, particularly at this transmission, which in electricity is this high voltage level. Further, there's a number of studies that suggest something more expansive, often referred to as a macro grid, and that's a nation-spanning series of high voltage transmission lines. And what this sort of infrastructure can provide is sharing of our vast geographic resources across our vast geographies. So moving energy long distances very quickly. And we have a lot of different resource opportunities in the United States, and this gives us a chance to share them sort of more easily than our current infrastructure does. And so these are just a couple examples of those macro grids that have been proposed in a number of decarbonization studies. So there's a couple of different models for transmission as enabling infrastructure, but all of them find that a significant amount of increased capacity is necessary. This is a challenge because transmission faces complex regulation and oversight. There's a role at the Department of Energy to study where there's transmission congestion and identify areas that need more transmission due to economic congestion, where the price differential is a problem. There's a role, there's an existing role for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. There's a modest role in the siting of electricity transmission lines, depending on these areas identified by the Department of Energy. And then there's a role in managing energy markets, defining sort of the rules of energy markets and of transmission operators in competition. And that's a fairly complex topic that I won't detail for you today, but there's a number of roles that Ferc plays explicitly and others that Ferc plays more implicitly, including a partnership with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation that sets reliability standards for electricity transmission. And then finally, there's a National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissions. And really, this logo is used because I couldn't fit 50 here on the slide, but this represents the state commissions, right? That every single state has a commission that has some often rather significant role in identifying and approving and citing transmission in the state. So there's a lot of complication here that can make it difficult to build out infrastructure, particularly at speed and scale. There's a couple of tensions at play here when we think about our decarbonization transition. Obviously, I've already identified the federal and state tension. Then we also see tensions at the consumer level. There's a demand for renewable and other clean energy resources. And there's also a matched concern with rising costs and lack of clarity at the consumer level about how those things do or do not conflict. There's a geographic diversity of resources, right? We have a lot of economic solar in the United States. It's not just in the Southwest. We have a lot of wind opportunity. We have geothermal. We're quite rich in that sense. But we also have existing generation and existing business models So we have these competing interests of incumbent owners of generation and transmission. I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone on this webinar about the salience of reliability and resilience. We saw cold snaps impact particularly Texas, but also the broader regions of the Great Plains. Same with heat waves, and then of course wildfires as well. And all of these have seen impacts on the electricity transmission area. And there have been some early studies that suggest that higher transmission capacity could have alleviated the outages in some of these cases. At the same time, some of those maps of those nation spanning grids represent a fundamentally different way of managing and moving energy in the country. And that is not a small technical complication that needs to be considered when we think about the challenges of this transition. So we brought together a group of experts in the spring that informed this joint report that we published in August that proposes a model for approaching this. And all of these tensions sort of came out this summer. This is an example article of those tensions at play. Power lines versus rooftop solar. And most experts in the transition will tell you that we need both. But again, we're facing these tensions at how we decide how to move forward. So we came up with this 5P model for how we think about a successful policy framework for addressing and building infrastructure. And let me quickly walk you through the 5 Ps here. There's planning. We need to know we need to decide where things should go, right? What are the future conditions that we expect, and what are the right factors for planning, and at what timescales, right? How do we update those plans? How do we implement those plans in a nimble enough way to meet our challenges and utilize new and developing technologies? Permitting. I already went through some of those tensions and differences in authorities for permitting at the federal versus the state, sometimes even the local level. So what are the right ways to cite and assess various impacts of infrastructure? So planning, permitting, participation is a really necessary part of building out infrastructure. When you think about the scale that we're talking about, there's a significant land impact. There's going to be impact to landowners, to communities that could be quite transformational and ideally economically beneficial. But what are the ways that we ensure that that participation is brought up to the same fore as the planning and permitting as an important part of this transition? How do we pay, of course? How are we financing these, and what does that mean about impacts to cost to consumers, and who is bearing those costs? And then finally, sort of a meta P is this P for process. The only way to scale, the only way to get this at speed and to get better at it over time is if we have a process that's repeatable. And right now we don't have that. We have quite a divided process, and transmission developers find that every single line is facing a unique set of circumstances. So there's not really an opportunity to learn and get better and bring those costs down and make those development speeds faster. So these are the 5 Ps that we propose need to be considered for any transmission infrastructure policy to really meet our decarbonization goals. And then in the report, we lay out those 4 of those Ps, because process, of course, is the meta P, across this span of private versus public. And we look at the existing policy, sort of where we see what we have now, which is quite a bit of on the private side, right? Where Ferc has really done a great job over its history in enhancing competition, right? And the ability of different developers to enter the market. And then there's some more on the public initiative side that have happened in the more recent decades. And then further, we built this out with any number of ideas that were sourced through our experts at the workshop. What are other models that we could approach? Because you'll notice our existing, each one is separate, right? And so we want to start thinking about a model that can touch all of these pieces, or how do we knit different of these concepts together to create a framework for successful policies moving forward. And I'm not going to read all of these to you today, but I hope you will look at our report and review them, where we go into significantly more detail. But the underlying conclusion that we come to is that we really need to think about where this authority should lie and how to build it. Are we looking at a national transmission organization, which is much further on the public initiative side? for expanded private investment, and how do we identify and relax those bottlenecks that are preventing significant private investment. And so we propose some further investigation into policy solutions that could cross these P's and develop a repeatable process, either on the private side or on the public initiative side. We've seen a little bit of movement in Congress. So there's some bills before Congress. I'm sure many of you are aware of what's moving in front of Congress in these past weeks and months. And one of them is the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which includes proposals to change some siting authority to expand the authority that FERC would have to site transmission lines, and proposes new and expanded financial mechanisms for paying. So we're looking at permitting here, we're looking at paying, but not all of the 5 Ps. There is no mention of a grid deployment authority, which is a Department of Energy concept that President Biden has discussed, or other organizing principles that would match these 5 facets that we believe are necessary to address a successful framework. And so the open question is, where do we go from here? And hoping to expand that discussion and get some answers, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsey Griffith at the Clean Air Task Force. She is the Federal Policy Director at CATF. Prior to joining the Clean Air Task Force, Lindsey was a policy advisor to Senator Edward Markey of Massachusetts. And she was also acting chief of staff in the Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis in the Department of Energy. So Lindsey's got quite a bit of climate and energy background to bring to the fore. And I'll turn it over to Lindsey to introduce our esteemed guest.
Thanks, Liza. Thanks for that great overview to kick us off. We're really excited and very fortunate to have Chairman of FERC, Rich Glick, here with us today. So welcome. A little bit about Rich, though I'm sure he needs no introduction. He became chair earlier this year on January 21st of 2021. He was confirmed by the Senate back in November of 2017. And prior to joining the committee, he was general counsel for the Democrats on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and served as a senior policy advisor on all things electricity and renewable energy. He, of course, has extensive experience in energy law and government affairs. So we're very lucky to have him here and all of his incredible experience to think about these issues a little bit with us. I think this workshop report is a start of a conversation, and this webinar is the start of that as well. So welcome, Chairman. I think if you're ready, I think we can just dive in. Go ahead if you want to say a quick hello to everybody that's with us today.
Well, thanks, Lindsey. It's good to see you again, and at least virtually. And I just want to say thank you all for inviting me to participate, and I've had a chance to look at your report and look forward to discussing it. It's very interesting.
Thanks. I want to jump right in. I think, Liza gave us a great overview of, how the report discusses expanding the traditional planning, paying, permitting 3P process to an additional 2, to making it 5, including participation and an overall frame on process. So what are your thoughts on expansion into those 2 very dynamic new areas? What do you see is there a path for FERC to engage with this framing to further policy in this space?
Well, I think it is a very important. Both of the other P's, participation and process, are very important elements of the whole concept here. I think, as was pointed out in the presentation, we definitely need significant amounts of additional transmission, and there's a lot of things that need to be done to get there. Some of it regulatory, some of it public acceptance, and some of it financing from the private sector, for instance. And from our perspective, from the FERC perspective, I think I want just to address the 3 traditional P's, so to speak. On permitting, as was pointed out, we have very limited authority. I'm more than glad to talk about that if you'd like, but we have very limited authority currently. But we have significant authority with regard to the planning for transmission, at least regional transmission planning, and also on cost allocation, the paying part, which are all those are kind of the 3-legged stool that we've always been talking about in terms of the big barriers to additional transmission development. But there is, I think that the participation part of this shouldn't be overlooked. when it comes to siting transmission lines, there's all sorts of legal issues and jurisdictional issues and so on. But in fact, you have to get buy-in from the public. And part of it is the recognition that we need additional transmission to access the renewable energy that most people in the public want. But they're also, they have to get buy-in in terms of paying for it. They have to get buy-in to the extent that transmission traverses an area close to where they live, or where they, where they might have a vacation home, for instance. And so it's enormously important that there is some sort of role to play. Secondly, there's some sort of role to play for the folks that are affected. But secondly, we've spent a lot of time at Ferc now thinking about environmental justice. We hadn't really thought of that much before. Quite frankly, the commission hadn't been that active on that issue. We actually have a new senior counsel that focuses exclusively on this issue and works with other people at the commission. But what is the transmission? What does the build out of transmission mean for environmental justice communities? Where are those transmission facilities to be located? What kind of impact are they going to have on these communities? And I think it's very important for folks that they have a role to play in terms of the decision-making process. But even and along those lines, I would say we look at environmental justice from an outward perspective, but also I should say an inward perspective at Ferc in terms of our decision-making process. But even more importantly, how do we encourage, at least for the Ferc role here, which is again primarily on the planning for and the planning for part of transmission, how do we encourage greater participation in our proceedings? And we have a new Office of Public Participation that I know that you worked on when you were on Capitol Hill, and other folks did as well, to essentially encourage Ferc to go forward, and which we have done, and form this Office of Public Participation. And it's one of the goals is to try to get affected communities, whether it be environmental justice communities, but others as well, to participate in our proceedings, not only in our proceedings, but also in regional proceedings, whether it be RTO proceedings, transmission planning proceedings. And I think by doing that, you get more buy-in up front for the big decisions that have to be made down the road.
I'm very excited to hear you mention the Office of Public Participation, but in particular, how you view that. That's an office at Ferc, but it's going to have a broader role, right, in this conversation about where our energy system, where our electricity system in particular is headed. That's really exciting to hear. I'd love to, building on that, you mentioned at the top of your comments that, permitting is not maybe something that Ferc currently plays a huge role in. I want to get into, and Liza mentioned this briefly, that the bipartisan infrastructure bill proposes some changes to transmission authority, including strengthening the backstop authority in particular. And the report that's out, which if folks are looking for the report, the title of it is "How Are We Going to Build All That Clean Energy Infrastructure?" And you can find it on both the Clean Air Task Force and the Niskanen Center websites. But there's much more than just sort of authority is needed. This, consistent, replicable, scalable process, right? So you need both the authority and then the way of sort of moving those issues forward in a way that's going to, and that sort of changes the paradigm really around transmission development. So I want to ask, what can Ferc do in practice, right, that maybe doesn't require new authority, whether on permitting or on any of these other Ps? Where do you see the opportunities to, make more consistent this process for developers and address some of the issues that we're seeing in the system?
Well, I think most people are probably aware that Ferc has, Ferc we issued several months ago an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and so it kicks off, a relatively comprehensive process aimed at improving our transmission regulations. And most of that is a lot of that, I should say, is aimed at interconnection processes, certainly planning and cost allocation as well. But we do ask some questions about other issues as well. And I think part of that is, how can we further facilitate a better environment, for want of a better term, for transmission development? And I think part of that is I think some of the discussions we're having is, is there a need for some sort of standardization is probably not a good word because FERC had standard market design many years ago, and there was a lot of pushback on that. But just in general, some sort of overall reasonable approach that I think people can rely on, other than the current approach, which is more of a region by region approach, and each region handles it significantly different. But I would also say that one of the things that we've been engaged in quite significantly lately is some discussion with our state colleagues. You mentioned the 50 different state commissions, and they're going to play a huge role. At siting, for instance, even if FERC gets this additional backstop siting authority, I think it's going to be somewhat limited in terms of its deployment. The states are still going to play an enormous role, and the question is, how do you bring in the states? And so what we've done is we've formed a joint task force with NARUC, and there are 10 state commissioners and the current 4 FERC commissioners on this task force, and we're kicking off our first meeting, I think, in a couple of weeks in Louisville. And one of the things we're going to be taking a look at is how can we facilitate an approach that the states can bring back to their own processes, but also how can the state interest in the FERC processes be included in terms of our future decision making. And I think there's something to be said there about some sort of common approach there. I think the states recognize that there's a lot of, more than they ever have, I think that there's a significant need for them to work together and work with FERC on some of these issues, and the same with us. I think that we realize that we can't do it alone either. And so I'm hopeful that this joint task force will lead to kind of a better approach overall in terms of transmission development that I think that can be used as a roadmap for folks around the country.
That's one of the workshop conclusions that came out in the report was that there is a need for that. It sounds like what this task force is doing, this fundamental rethinking around how you approach transmission and rebalance, not just state, federal, but also let's talk about the public-private a little bit, right? So in transmission, so where do you see FERC sort of fitting along that spectrum, and what should FERC's role be? How is FERC, what's the way that FERC can interact most successfully with these different types of entities that are engaged in electricity transmission development, management, delivery, the whole spectrum of what's needed to make this system possible?
So given the current regulatory paradigm through the Federal Power Act and so on, our role with regard to private entities and private investments in transmission is very significant. We certainly regulate interstate transmission, at least by that are developed and owned by and operated by investor-owned utilities and RTOs and so on. We have a pretty significant role to play in terms of how some of the decisions, for instance, what kind of incentives do we have statutory authority to provide incentives to entities that build transmission for certain reasons, for instance, or certainly we provide rates of return that I think we decide what a just and reasonable rate is for their for transmission investments, including the return on their investments. And that provides, I think, plays a significant role in private sector decision making in terms of whether they build transmission or not. They certainly remind us of that all the time. That if we just gave them more money, they somehow would build more transmission. But nonetheless, that's an important role to play. I think without additional legislative authority, we don't have much of a role to play in terms of governmental, whether it be national government or state government decisions with regard to transmission development. But we should recognize the federal government right now plays a huge role in transmission that we don't really talk about a lot. But in the Western United States, you take the Bonneville Power Administration and the Western Area Power Administration, WAPA, and the two of them are two of the biggest, if not the two biggest, owners of transmission per mile in the West, in the Western Interconnect. And they continue to develop transmission. Obviously, there are funding constraints there, but they play a huge role in terms of the development of the transmission grid, or will play a huge role in the development of the transmission grid on a going forward basis. There are other governmental entities. TVA is not really a government, it's kind of a government corporation, but they obviously build a lot of transmission, but there are other state and local municipal utilities, for instance, some state entities also build and develop transmission. I think that to the extent we move more towards a governmental approach towards the development of transmission and paying for transmission and so on, is probably going to require additional legislation. Some of that is going to be addressed presumably in this reconciliation bill, to the extent that there's an agreement sufficiently to move it forward. I suspect there'll be funding for additional government efforts on transmission. But in terms of the overall paradigm, I still think that's going to be, for the immediate future, significantly reliant on the development of transmission by private industry.
Yeah, it's a lot of the federal build, own, operate models from that have their origins decades ago provided a lot of the discussion fodder for our workshop. So I'm glad you brought that up. I want to ask about one of the policy ideas that the report were proposed that sort of builds on those, which is this idea of a national transmission organization. Is that Ferc? Is that an evolution for Ferc, or is that a different agency? I mean, what is necessary here? I mean, I think these are interesting models to think about, and would love your take.
So it could be Ferc. We certainly have, I think, a significant amount of expertise. I would also argue the Department of Energy may even have more expertise than us on some of these issues, for instance, in the role that they play in establishing national interest electric transmission corridors. For instance, they have some expertise on transmission planning that, quite frankly, we don't have at FERC. I think the one caveat I would say about that is that time is of the essence here, right? So we know that there's an enormous demand for building out emissions-free generation. We know it's going to require a lot of transmission, but it has to be done relatively quickly. And to the extent we pursue new models, such as the National Transmission Organization, I'm not opposed to it. I think there's arguably some benefits associated with it. I think that the concern that some might have is that it might take a while to develop that model, and we may not have the time to do that. We may have to, it may be more time efficient to continue with the current approach.
Yeah, Liza's presentation noted that there are a lot of studies out there that find that this significant expansion that's going to be needed in transmission and other clean energy infrastructure, that we're focused on transmission here. So, you sort of hinted at it, but I'd like to follow up and ask, do you think our existing system can enable growth at the speed that's sort of laid out in the Princeton study or in other electricity sector studies?
So in some ways, I would say that we have no choice, that it has to be capable of meeting the challenge because of I think there's, between the move towards zero emissions resources and electrification of the grid, there's just enormous amount of pent-up demand for this cleaner generation that we have to, and not only I should say, not just to access renewable energy, but to deal with, as was pointed out in the presentation, to deal with some of the resiliency and reliability issues associated with extreme weather. So we have to build out the grid. I think the problem is that we've seen in the past, it takes a long time, on the average of 10 years or so, from start to finish to actually plan a transmission facility and then actually finish building it and put it into operation. We may not have that time, but I think there's a growing acceptance both at the state level and I think even in the federal government that we need to improve our regulatory processes in a way that would help facilitate a more aggressive approach. And I talked to a lot of state commissioners, and I think they realize that their states have set these very ambitious goals, and they have to figure out a way to maybe get beyond some of the regulatory hurdles. And that's true of the federal government too. Just taking on siting, I mentioned FERC doesn't have much siting authority right now, but a lot of transmission in the Western United States goes over federal land, and whether it be the Forest Service or BLM, we know those processes take forever, but I think there's a real interest within the Biden administration and elsewhere to try to figure out if there are improvements that can be made and hopefully made relatively quickly. And that's what we're doing on the ANOPA process. We're actually trying to do the same thing within the responsibilities that we have under the law.
So you mentioned both state and federal actions around, whether we call them clean energy targets or investments, whatever we want to call them. I mean, these are all intended to motivate these changes. Do you think those targets are going to motivate the changes you're describing and that this report identifies? Are they going to motivate them sufficiently? Well,
I'll answer the way I did the last question. I think there's really no choice. I think this, of course, it's very hard to predict how the political climate may change over the next several years. But I would say currently, there's significant recognition that we can't continue on the current path, whether it be on emissions or, again, dealing with some of the, I want to point out the reliability issues, and it was Liza mentioned earlier that the situation in Texas. We shouldn't ignore the fact that transmission, or the lack thereof, played a substantial role. Now Texas doesn't want to, in some cases, they don't, ERCOT portion of Texas doesn't want to be interconnected to the rest of the grid because they don't want to be subject to federal regulation. We could talk about that if you'd like, but the lack of interconnection with the rest of the grid proved deadly. I mean, literally deadly. People died because they didn't have access to electricity. Now, if they had a significant additional interregional connections, would they not have had any blackouts? I think it's hard to say that would be the case, but I think the argument can clearly be made that it would have been much better. Look at MISO and SPP. They were suffering from the same weather conditions. They were suffering from the same level of internal power plant outages. They had about 30,000 megawatts down as well, just like Texas did, ERCOT did. But they were able to bring in power from elsewhere, primarily PJM, because of interconnections. And so I think it's just it's too important not to at least make the effort to try to achieve what is clearly a monumental task. So I'm hopeful, at least, that we will be able to, cut out the red tape, so to speak, and get things done.
So let the record show you raised Texas and ERCOT first. So I'm going to go there. This is an area with two major load centers, but how does it factor into the national transmission conversation and into sort of FERC's considerations at this point?
Well, it doesn't factor significantly in terms of FERC's considerations because, as I mentioned earlier, at least in the ERCOT, which is the major portion of Texas, we don't have jurisdiction under the Federal Power Act. So the changes that we are looking at, whether it be cost allocation planning, interconnection, reform, that would all be outside of ERCOT anyway. But I think this issue, we do have authority, as was mentioned earlier, as I mentioned earlier, we do have authority over reliability of the bulk power system, and that does include Texas. And so one of the things we are looking at is what kind of standards should be applied to the mandatory reliability standards should be applied to it to address some of the concerns that were raised in the aftermath of last winter, the winter storm Uri last February. And a lot of that is really on weatherizing power plants. But I think one of the things the report calls out is we need to take a look at better interregional interconnections. And we need to do that at FERC anyway throughout the country. But I think Texas, and it's not up to me, it's up to them. But I would implore them to take another look at this, that it can't be that important to want to avoid FERC jurisdiction that you would literally endanger your people to the extent you have another cold weather situation. And so I'm hoping that we can work something out on that front.
That's great. I'm going to give up the microphone, or rather, we've got some questions from the audience. So I'd encourage folks, if you have them, to please put them in the Q&A box. I'm going to do my best to get to a few of them here for the chairman before we have to conclude. So first, the first question we have is about the macro grid, right? And in some ways, the transmission report that in this discussion workshop report that came out, we're really sort of, a lot of the studies that were examined show that there is a lot of transmission to be built. So whether you're talking about a macro grid or simply massively expanding transmission, I'd love to know sort of what you think. We've talked a little bit about that, but probability on a macro grid specifically, do you think that we're moving towards building something like that in the next decade, whether it's because of the reliability concerns that you noted or because of other issues, because of demand for renewable energy? What would drive that, expansion?
I think both of those circumstances would and should drive it. I mean, you mentioned there are an increasing number of reports out there that are arguing for this type of an approach, in large part because it would be, again, increased reliability, but also would significantly reduce the cost associated with going to a carbon-free or close to a carbon-free electric generation grid. So I think there's significant benefits associated with it. It's a challenge. It's a challenge because it costs a lot of money. It's a challenge because from a regulatory perspective, you'd be kind of putting upside down the current approach. and to the way we actually think about regional electric grids and the regional approach to operating the grid. But again, I think this one of those situations is very important, something we should consider. But again, I think what I said earlier about the kind of having a national transmission organization, I think that given, I'm not sure we have the time to think this through and to make all the regulatory changes and provide the funding. That at this point, I think the focus probably should be on how we can use the existing system to add as much transmission as we can add. At the same time, thinking on a longer term basis, would a macro grid be a more efficient approach than we currently have?
Interesting. So I want to get specifically then into we've got a question in the chat about, looking back historically at where transmission lines often bump up against hurdles, whether it's because of NEPA review or other federal environmental laws. What do you think that process, whether it's ESA, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, wetland permitting, how do we do these things at speed and scale at the same time we have these, necessary environmental backstops in place? What's your thought on, if we're going to take the system we have and seek improvements, how are we going to do that when, like you said, it's been taking a decade or more to build some of the infrastructure that we need?
Well, I'll use the analogy to some authority Ferc does have today, and that is the siting of interstate natural gas pipelines. And there's been a lot of debate about that recently. There's been some controversies associated with it. But I think the lesson that I take away is not that, well, let's try to figure out a way to cut corners and not do the NEPA reviews or the Endangered Species Act reviews or the other environmental reviews. Because when you do that, and we've seen it in the natural gas industry a lot lately, is that when you do that, all you end up doing is inviting litigation, and then in many cases, the courts will send back to the agencies for another round, additional regulatory oversight. And all that does is to further delays projects and causes the projects to cost billions of dollars extra than they should. I think for me the better approach is to recognize the laws that we live under, and a lot of these laws provide significant benefits, and to figure out a way to do this up front. I think there's a lot of examples in all sorts of siting of infrastructure in which if you bring in folks up front, try to address these issues up front, developers of big transmission projects, for instance, could mitigate potential environmental issues that might arise through the regulatory process. You're actually going to expedite the process much more significantly than if you litigate every last issue out. So that would be more of a recommendation to developers to take a more proactive approach and bring in, again, the process and the participation elements that you all talk about in your report. I think if you do that up front, you're going to get a lot more buy-in for these projects and reduce the litigation risk.
You mentioned developers, but I want to go to the sort of how the public is going to be involved in this. And there's a question in the chat about the trade-offs between rural areas potentially bearing the brunt of disruption from new transmission build-out and maximum benefit in urban or rapidly urbanizing areas in this country. So how can that be mitigated? Are you all thinking about that in the Office of Public Participation or through this environmental justice lens? And what types of solutions are you considering?
So we are considering that. I don't know if I have solutions. I would say from the Office of Public Participation perspective, we are considering how to reach out to those folks in rural areas. And again, we do this again on the natural gas pipeline. You see the same exact scenarios on natural gas pipelines. A lot of times we're developing these projects in rural areas for the most part, but you're bringing in gas to the urban areas for the most part. And so how do you again educate folks on the process? How do you make sure that again that they can upfront participate and encourage them to do so? On the environmental justice side, that's where I think that's really the issue that we've been giving a lot of thought to lately is how do you address some of the whether it be a rural area or even an urban area where that has like high instances of asthma, that there's a lot of sometimes it's easier for developers to build projects in areas where other projects have already been developed, whether it be transmission lines or or gas pipelines or anything else or any other type of infrastructure project. And you create all sorts of issues there with communities that have already been adversely impacted by those previous infrastructure projects. So that's what we're giving a lot of thought to, is how do you assess the concerns by the community? How do you make sure that the community raises their concerns? But then how do you mitigate those concerns? That's what we're spending a lot of time thinking lately about in the pipeline side, thinking about mitigation. Again, I think it's an issue that can be better resolved if the developers of these projects early on work with the communities, the affected communities, and try to mitigate as much as they can. Another way of doing it, of course, I'm not saying it's the only, it's a simple alternative, but certainly I think payments, transmission developers make payments today, just like any other. I used to work for a company that developed wind and solar projects, and I think a lot of the land that these projects were on, the folks got royalty payments, and I think there's a similar. I would assume a similar approach would be taken with regard to transmission development.
What's the role for states in this? Or the PUCs for that matter. If you're going to encourage transmission development at faster speed and for clean energy in particular, like renewables, if there isn't going to be federal legislation to address this, what role can these states play? And are there things to learn from, the way that Ferc has to date balanced regional flexibility with national needs? What are your thoughts on that?
So first of all, I think there's an enormous role for the states to play. And even if Congress does provide FERC with additional backstop siting authority, the states will still be the preeminent source for siting these transmission lines. From FERC's role, at the most, FERC is going to maybe get a chance in certain cases to second guess certain decisions by the states. And I'm not even saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying stating what the legislation would do. But states are still going to have an enormous role with regard to that. But I think the key is, and this is something we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about at the Joint Task Force, is bringing in states early on in the planning process. Transmission in many parts of the country is planned on a regional basis, at least significant transmission lines are. And I think you're going to see a growing amount of regional transmission planning. And if the states have a role up front in terms of the planning of those lines, also the cost in helping to adjudicate the cost allocation, at least helping to through the FERC process, helping to figure out the best approach for allocating the cost for those particular transmission facilities. I think that actually, again, helps them, brings them into the decision making, and probably makes them more likely to facilitate the siting of those lines when the siting decisions come up for their consideration.
Can we talk a little bit about interstate collaboration too, which is obviously tremendously important in transmission planning? If there's not going to be more mandates for action, what are some things that could be done to incentivize voluntary collaboration on this front? And that's not necessarily the role that FERC is playing, but these are things that would certainly sort of enable the conversations that you all are trying to have and move forward. So what do you think is the potential there? Is there anything that could be done to incentivize more interstate collaboration?
Yeah, so I think we issued a policy statement, or actually I should say we issued a policy statement about the same time that we issued this advanced NOPR, in which the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, I should say, in which the policy statement mentioned that we have a way of approaching transmission planning through FERC Order 1000, which was issued a number of years ago. But there are other alternatives, and one of the alternatives is states can collaborate amongst themselves or collaborate in conjunction with the RTOs that serve the area that those states are located in, to do their own transmission planning, do their own transmission cost allocation approach, and that doesn't even necessarily require a federal process. And so, we've seen recently New Jersey with regard to some transmission development associated with accessing offshore wind development that's occurring, I think, off of Atlantic City, for instance. They're actually doing that. They're working with the RTO. They're doing it outside of this national process. But I think as we continue to see additional development of transmission, additional pressure on the states, I think you're going to see a significant amount whether it be a compact, an official compact, or something like a compact, the states working together to do they can do it without necessarily coming to FERC and spending a lot of time and money in our process.
So that's a great segue to, this report takes a look at this process. That's one sort of area where there's a lot of potential. How can, we've got more than 60 folks on the call today, how can today's audience, support FERC, support Congress, support others in establishing these necessary processes that will enable more and faster transmission build out?
So with regard to FERC, I strongly encourage, and I suspect a lot of the folks listening in work for organizations that have already submitted their first round of comments on our ANOPR, but I would strongly recommend participating in that process through the reply comments. We have a technical conference coming up. There'll be additional comments that will be submitted after that technical conference. And even now, this is just an advanced NOPR. There will be at some point there will be a notice of proposal rulemaking. There'll be another round or maybe two of comments. So I certainly would strongly suggest you people submit comments, but also don't hesitate to come in and talk to us, myself, the other commissioners, staff. We're always looking for helpful ideas. With regard to the, I think with regard to Congress, and I would say maybe with the states too, is just to the extent that you believe this, I think it's important to go to members of Congress and recognize how important transmission is. I think 10 years ago, there might have been maybe one or two or three members of Congress, Senate or House, that even thought about transmission issues. Now there's a good number of them, not enough maybe, but there's a good number of them that realize that transmission is the linchpin to what's going on here. And I think it's important to continue to educate members of Congress and other policymakers how important an element this is to the whole notion of not only, again, addressing climate change, but also addressing the risks associated with the reliability risks associated with growing amounts of extreme weather.
Folks are in the chat are really curious about the status of carbon pricing within FERC, but because Clean Air Task Force we're a climate change nonprofit, for those of you who don't know us, and we focus on all sorts of solutions for transitioning our energy system to zero carbon. And we focus a lot on opportunities and challenges like those we've been discussing today. So I'd love to get your take on the carbon pricing question, but also ask, what do you see as FERC's role in the energy transition and in addressing the climate crisis, right? How has that evolved in your time on the commission, and how do you see it evolving from where we are today?
So with regard to the first question, we have issued a policy statement, I say it's a year and a half ago or so now, in which we essentially said, to the extent that regions or states on their own come up with carbon pricing mechanisms, and those states are located in regional markets, RTOs, that we would facilitate the pricing associated with those policies in terms of the wholesale markets that we oversee. But to date, no state has essentially taken us up on it. No state has actually adopted their own carbon pricing regime, at least states located in these regional markets. New York has been pretty far along, but they've been talking about it for a while, but still haven't implemented their own program. But we certainly would again be willing to facilitate. At least I think a majority of commissioners would be willing to facilitate that. I think there's a significant legal issue as to whether FERC on our own has the ability to impose carbon pricing in these markets. I tend to think we do not have that authority. It's a very controversial issue, but some people have come to us and said, "Oh, you should just do it. If we can't pass it in Congress, FERC should just do it for us." I just don't. I'm not sure that would survive a legal challenge, and that would probably create more headaches than I think is maybe worth it. With regard to FERC's role on climate issues in general, I would say, first of all, when I first came to FERC, which is, it's amazing to me, it's been almost 4 years now, it was in November of 2017, it became apparent really early on. I hadn't really given a lot of thought to FERC's perspective on climate change issues when I was preparing to get confirmed, for instance. But everyone coming in to us on a whole variety of issues, all the different stakeholders on different issues, we're talking about climate change much more frequently than they had in the past. And it became apparent that we have a very significant role to play, but it's a role to play in terms of the effects of our decisions have an impact on the energy industry and where it's headed in terms of carbon reductions, for instance, but we don't have, pursuant to our statutory authority, we're not out there leading the charge saying the grid has to be this, or the grid has to be that. We essentially just react to what's happening in the marketplace. It's not necessarily even state policies, although that's significant. We're seeing, it's consumers. Consumers are demanding their utilities acquire a significant amount of additional renewable resources. And so from our role, the way I see our role to play, at least under the Federal Power Act, is our role is to prevent discrimination. So to the extent that there are market rules that in many cases were established before some of these newer technologies such as storage are really feasible, our role is to get rid of those market barriers, those rules, and to make the reach to modify those rules to, again, facilitate participation of these technologies, but not necessarily to be a cheerleader for them. That's for other agencies. It's more just to make sure there's a level playing field so those types of technologies can do what they were intended to do, but in a sense not be discriminated against versus older traditional technologies.
So looking ahead in the next few years, are there specific things, on that agenda of sort of preventing discrimination between these technologies, or on some of the other things we've talked today, anything, specific that you see on the horizon for Ferc?
So I think, we in the last few years, we've made quite a bit of progress on energy storage and also on facilitating distributed energy resource, at least aggregated distributed energy resource participation in our wholesale markets. I think there are other issues that we're looking at now, for instance, on the with regard to hybrid projects, storage and wind or storage and solar, for instance, wave storage or any other technology. There are some issues that we might need to address in terms of removing some barriers there. That may be true also for offshore wind. But in addition to that, we're also taking a look at our energy market reform, or I should say reform of the energy, ancillary service, and capacity markets in the RTOs and ISOs around the country. We know that because of the way the grid is changing, there's a growing need for greater flexibility. It's not entirely clear that our current approach to addressing issues associated with capacity or resource adequacy, I should say, is sufficient to address the needs of the future. So that's what we're taking a look at that as well, and that's going to have a significant, in a way, it's a reaction to what's going on in the marketplace, but a significant. I think it's a significant undertaking given where the grid is headed.
It's a big challenge. Any last words you want to offer us today? We're running up against time here, and I'm going to give it to our some closing remarks over to our executive director in a moment. But any last words on, how are we going to build all that clean energy infrastructure? Thank you again for joining us. Go ahead.
I appreciate it. My answer isn't a great one. It's just that we have no choice, right? I think we have to do it when there's a will. There's always seems to be a way. But it just beyond that, I would also encourage folks listening out there, as I did a few minutes ago, just participate as much as you can in terms of our processes and state processes, also other federal processes as well. It's very important that we have your input and also your support in terms of moving forward with this ambitious agenda.
Thank you again so much for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. In the last 5 minutes, thank you to our audience. I'm going to turn it over to Armin Cohen, who's the Executive Director of Clean Air Task Force, and just to share some final thoughts on the report and bid you all a fond farewell. So thank you.
Thank you, Lindsey, and Chairman Glick, thank you for joining, and Liza, thank you for laying out the broad contours of the report. I just want to close with maybe a couple thoughts based on what we've heard, and really riffing off of Chairman Glick's comment that we have no choice. I think we really have to fess up to the size of this challenge and how much of it is a step change from history. This is a graph that came out of a recent report from JP Morgan, and it shows the annual build of US transmission infrastructure starting in 1978. And you can see those blue lines, we kind of move at a pretty pokey pace to the point where we are in 2020. Now, the red dots are the first line that's drawn here shows the base case that Liza showed you earlier from Princeton, which is a system that's about 80% renewable energy. Then there's a higher renewable case, if you just can push the next button, which shows an even more discontinuous pace of growth. So whether you select the base case or the extremely high renewables case, we're really talking about things that we've never accomplished, even remotely, in terms of annual transmission build in the US. Which leads me to the second slide, Liza, which is, this is my favorite cartoon from the New Yorker, which two guys are standing at a blackboard with a complicated set of equations, and in the middle there's a statement that then a miracle occurs, and one is saying to the other, I think you should be more explicit here in step two. That's the kind of challenge I think we're facing. This is uncharted territory. The purpose of the report was, I know many people on this call are, have participated in many Ferc processes and many webinars like this, and there have been many reports. But the thrust of this report is we have to think different about this problem, because it is such a significant break with our historical practice. And so I'll make no secret of it that of the chart that we showed you earlier, CATF tends to lean more towards the breaking of the glass side of the spectrum. That is something more akin to a national planning function or a national transmission organization. In the most extreme version, it would actually be publicly owned transmission infrastructure. And of course, there are precedents for that in the power marketing agencies. And now we're seeing in New Jersey and California and New Mexico examples of the state actually saying, we will build this to cut through the gridlock. So the thought I think we really want to leave you with, the point of the paper was to be provocative, to sort of get us out of our, fighting on the 40-yard line and think about the goal. And we hope that the report and the webinar today has done that. We look forward to working with many of you as are willing, to really push the boundary of this debate, which is really what we think needs to happen here, just waking up to the size of the lift that's implied by those graphics. And so with that, we thank you for joining us. Thank you to our colleagues at the Niskanen Center. Liza, any closing words?
I'll just echo the thank yous from everybody, and note that Niskanen and CATF came together from very different perspectives on this. So really looking forward to continuing that engagement on how we move forward.